Imagine being forgotten by the whole world, while the sky still whispers your name every day. A story where darkness tried to silence a life, but the light of Christ shone even brighter. Today, you will discover a journey of courage, unshakable faith, and silent miracles. A true story that proves that, even when everything seems lost, heaven never stops fighting for us. I'm going to tell you this incredible story now, which talks about resistance in the midst of pain, faith that survives in the shadows, and a love that not even torture could erase. Get ready, because what you're going to hear today could transform the way you see faith. For 14 years, I was buried alive, not in an earthen tomb, but in a cell so dark that even my own memory seemed afraid to enter. The cold, damp walls knew every desperate beat of my heart, every prayer whispered in solitude. There was no light, there was no sound, there was no visible hope, just a suffocating emptiness trying to convince me that I had been forgotten forever. But what not even the worst prison could take from me was the living presence of Jesus Christ. The days and nights blended into endless darkness, and I no longer knew if I was awake or dreaming. Every breath became an act of faith, every beat of my heart a wordless prayer. Amid the absolute abandonment, there was something, or rather somebody, which whispered to my spirit, "You are not alone." It was invisible to human eyes, but more real than any cold wall around me. And while the world seemed to have erased me from history, the sky continued to pronounce my name. Extreme loneliness would have destroyed any hope, but it was there, in complete silence, that I learned to truly listen. The absence of human voices made space for me to hear a much greater voice. I discovered that light does not come from the eyes, but from the spirit. That true freedom does not depend on the walls that surround you, but on the faith that sustains you. And it was this faith that fed me when there was no bread, that warmed me when the cold seemed to tear my skin. Can you imagine surviving a single day without seeing sunlight? Now, try to imagine 14 years and still believe that there is a greater purpose. I know that many faced with such darkness would have abandoned all hope, but for me, every moment of pain was like a secret song dedicated to God. Each tear was a seed watered with faith. Every faint beat of my heart echoed like a scream, "I'm still here, sir." And so as my body was consumed, my soul grew stronger in ways no oppressor could understand. The authorities could try to erase my existence from the earth, but there was something they could never achieve, the eternal bond between me and my Savior. In the darkness of that cell, while the world forgot who I was, heaven called me by name. And it was this certainty that kept me alive day after day, year after year, until one day, the light hit my fragile eyes again. But that's part of the story I'm still going to tell you. Surviving is too small a word for what I experienced. I didn't just survive, I was sustained by the love of Christ every second my tormentors tried to bury me alive. And today, I am proof that darkness will never have the last word. Do you believe that God's presence can be more real than the pain they try to impose on us? Answer in the comments, yes or no, and stay with me, because in the next chapter, you will see how, even in the longest night, God always prepares the dawn. I was born in Cluj, a charming city in the heart of Romania, surrounded by ancient mountains and narrow streets that seemed to hold secrets from centuries past. My childhood was filled with ancient songs, whispered prayers, and Jewish traditions loaded with meaning. In the eyes of outsiders, we were a deeply religious, devout family, connected to the roots of the faith of our ancestors. Shabbat was celebrated with reverence, candles lit, bread braided on the table, wine clinking in glasses. Everything seemed perfect, but inside me there was an emptiness that not even the most beautiful of rituals could fill. While my family sang the psalms with tears in their eyes, I stared at the candle flames, as if staring at a cold, impenetrable wall. Those little lights flickered before me, but they didn't warm the cold I felt inside. I asked myself, as a child, if God is here, why does he seem so far away? With each celebration, with each prayer, this feeling of being isolated within a living tradition grew like a shadow that I didn't know how to shake. And the more others' voices rose in adoration, the more mine fell silent in doubt. In my house, we talked a lot about God, about his deeds, his promises, his laws. Every word was delivered with almost solemn respect. It was as if we were trying to build a bridge to heaven using only inherited memories. But deep inside my heart, an insistent question echoed, if he's so close, Why doesn't he ever talk to me? They taught me to repeat blessings before each meal, to respect each commandment, to celebrate each feast. But no one could teach me how to hear God's voice amid the noise of tradition. And that gap grew silently, like an invisible rift that threatened to shatter everything from within. Over time, I began to keep my questions to myself. Little by little, I stopped waiting for answers. It was easier to wear a smile during parties, recite sacred texts, and do what was expected of me. I grew up learning to hide the emptiness that consumed me, because deep down I feared that admitting this hunger would make me unworthy in front of my family and my community. So, like many other young people, I adopted a mask. On the outside, a devout boy. Inside, a silent heart. And the more time passed, the more I accepted that maybe God was just a beautiful idea, reserved for those who knew how to believe without questioning. Many years later, I read research that said that one of human beings' greatest emotional pains is feeling invisible. I knew this before I even knew the meaning of the word invisible. I knew because, while everyone was singing and dancing at religious festivals, I felt like a ghost sitting at the table. It was there, but it didn't quite belong. And with each new cycle of celebrations, with each new song that echoed through the walls of the house, my heart moved a little further away from that God who seemed to prefer silence to my company. And, yet deep down, a part of me still wanted him to see me. That somehow broke that silence. The curious thing is that when hope begins to die, the heart becomes fertile ground for disbelief. Without realizing it, I was turning into a skeptic as a boy. I started to look at the world with the cold eyes of reason. If I couldn't hear God, if I couldn't feel him, if he didn't respond, then maybe it was all invention. Maybe all those stories were just stories, and the faith that should have nourished me since childhood turned into a shell that hid a deep inner desert. But little did I know that the God I thought was absent was already preparing the most unexpected encounter of my life. God's silence is sometimes not his absence, but his invitation. An invitation to a deeper, more sincere, more transformative search than any tradition or rite could offer. And it was in this silence that my true journey began, even when I thought I had already given up. Have you ever felt like God was silent when you needed him most? Answer here, yes or no. Next, you will discover how this silent void became the battlefield where my faith, or lack thereof, would begin to be shaped. Brace yourself. I became an atheist before I even understood what faith was. It was not a conscious decision, nor a planned rebellion. It was something that simply happened inside me, like a candle that slowly goes out, without anyone noticing. I grew up believing that the universe was just a grand accident, a collision of blind forces that, on a whim, ended up generating what we call life. To me, humans were little more than cosmic dust, with the illusion of purpose. It was a mistake that, ironically, had developed enough awareness to realize its own insignificance. And honestly, I thought it was foolish to look for meaning where there was only chaos. I started looking at the prayers of my childhood, like someone looking at an old book of fables. I respected the faith of my parents, my neighbors, previous generations, but I saw it all as an emotional tradition, a human attempt to fill the fear of emptiness. And like many young people at that time, I let rationalism take the throne of my heart. God, to me, was just the word weak people used to name things they couldn't explain. The more I studied, the more I believed that faith was a shelter built by those who could not face the cold vastness of the universe. And the more reason grew, the more the emptiness inside me seemed to scream. What I didn't know, what I would never have dared to imagine, is that God was waiting for me exactly where my reason refused to enter. True faith, I would later discover, is not the denial of reason, but the courage to go beyond it. And it was this courage that found me on a silent night, behind thick curtains and closed windows, in one of the clandestine meetings that spread like small embers under the cold wind of repression. In that cramped room, lit only by a few flickering candles, I heard for the first time about a Christ unlike anything I had ever learned. Not a demanding God, thirsty for rituals and sacrifices, but a God who sacrificed himself, what surrendered, what he humiliated himself until death, for love. The words of that clandestine preacher went through my logic like an arrow through the fog. I found myself listening not with my ears, but with something that had been dormant inside me for years. Each sentence seemed to tear through the walls of rationality I had built to protect myself. I, who had so often mocked faith as a refuge for fools, now felt tears burning my eyes without knowing why. There, in that moment, hidden from the world, the skeptic that I was began to die. And for the first time I began to understand that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't a cosmic mistake, but part of a much larger story. It was not an emotional explosion, nor a mystical trance. It was like a gentle hand resting on the shoulder of a weary traveler. It was as if an ancient voice, forgotten by the ages, was whispering, "I've always been here, you're the one who got lost." That Christ that I barely knew revealed himself not as an imposition, but as an invitation. Not as a set of rules, but as a hug. And faced with this reality, something that I still cannot fully describe happened inside me. Something died: pride, skepticism, sarcasm, and in their place, a man was born willing to lose everything except the cross he now carried inside his chest. If you've ever studied history, you might know that ideas have power. Revolutions, wars, and entire movements were born from ideas planted in the right hearts. That night, an idea found me, but not a human idea, fragile and full of vanities. An eternal truth, a truth that would transform not only my worldview, but the meaning of my own existence. And that seed, planted in the midst of fear and persecution, would soon begin to blossom in ways even I could not predict. Sometimes, the most transformative moment in our lives happens just when we think we already know all the answers. It was in the silence of doubt that God spoke loudest to me, and it was in my arrogance that He planted the miracle of faith. Do you believe that even the biggest skeptic can be reached by God? Leave your answer here, yes or no, and stay with me, because in the next chapter, you'll see how a simple choice can change the entire destiny of a life, and maybe even the course of history. We were a church of shadows. We gathered in the city's forgotten cracks, in dank basements and abandoned barns, where the smell of mustiness and fear permeated the air. We spoke little, almost nothing, as if even words could betray us. Our praises were whispered, almost breathed, because we knew that at any moment a sharp knock on the door could mean the end. Every song was an act of rebellion, each prayer a manifesto against a system that wanted us mute, invisible, extinct. But we insisted on singing, not for the world to hear, but because we knew that even if our voices were silenced, the stones would scream for us. Each verse we recited was a spiritual weapon, more powerful than any clenched fist or human decree. We read the scriptures by the flickering light of makeshift candles, on fragile hand-stitched pages, passed from hand to hand as if they were the greatest treasure on earth. And to us, they were. In those clandestine meetings, a simple meeting could be, and often was, a death sentence. None of us knew if we would return home. But paradoxically, we have never been more alive than in that vulnerability. The certainty of imminent death made life burn within us with a force that words cannot contain. It was as if, each time we risked our lives, the roots of our faith sank even deeper into the soil of eternity. Holding that rustic Bible, sewn by calloused hands that loved the Word more than their own safety, I felt something that I could not explain in human words. It was more than courage, more than faith. It was an absolute surrender, a delivery that transcended fear, pain, and even love for life itself. And it was then that, in an almost imperceptible voice, I declared, "Christ is all I have, and therefore He is worth more than my life." At that moment, it wasn't just a sentence, it was an oath, a secret pact between me and heaven, engraved not in ink, but in blood and spirit. It is curious to think that many of the great movements in history were driven by fiery speeches in public squares, by leaders with thundering voices and passionate crowds. But what we were was different. We had no pulpits, no choirs, no applause. We had only the whisper of the Word in hearts that were pounding with fear, and yet they chose to worship. Perhaps the world will never know the names of those who sang with me at that time. They may never know about the faces hidden behind the curtains, but I know. And I know that, in the eyes of heaven, each sigh of faith was recorded as an eternal song that time will never erase. In that invisible church, I discovered something that many go their entire lives without realizing. True worship does not need microphones or spotlights. It is born in the hiding place of pain, blossoms in the soil of sacrifice, and rises like an invisible perfume, irresistible to the heart of God. While men sought to silence us with prisons and torture, we were strengthened by a force they could never understand. And deep down, each of us knew If one day our voices were ripped from the earth, the echo of our faith would continue dancing in the wind. When everything around you demands you deny your faith, standing firm is not just an act of courage. It's a silent scream that shakes hell itself. Worshipping in freedom is beautiful. Worshipping in persecution is divine. Do you believe that the true strength of faith appears precisely in moments of greatest danger? Answer here, yes or no, and stay with me, because in the next chapter you will discover the day that this courage was put to the test in the most brutal way. Prepare your heart. It was 1950, the year in which hope, for many, seemed to have been officially declared an enemy of the state. I was at home, in a rare moment of peace, when the knock on the door interrupted everything. It was dry. No warning, no ad. Like thunder that precedes a storm you know you can't avoid. For a brief moment, my heart wanted to believe that it was just an ordinary visitor, a mistake, perhaps a desperate neighbor. But deep down, I knew. Something about the starkness of that sound carried a dark portent that words could not describe. When I opened the door, I saw no faces, just weapons. Rifles pointed at me like accusing fingers, ready to judge and condemn without the right to defense. There were no words exchanged, no orders shouted, just brutal, swift action. They grabbed me by the arms and threw me against the icy wall of the corridor. The shock of my body against the cold stone cut off my breath for a second that seemed like an eternity. Then, without ceremony, they blindfolded my eyes with a rough cloth, so tight that it seemed to want to crush my thoughts along with my vision. In that instant, the light I knew disappeared, and a new darkness began to reign. I was taken to a building that seemed to have been ripped from the very womb of the earth, a place with no windows, no name, no return. Every step I was forced to take echoed like the sound of a funeral, and the smell of damp rust and despair saturated the air around me. They didn't ask my name. They didn't say where I was going. For them, I was just another number, a shadow to be erased. But inside me, something whispered, even if they throw you into darkness, the light you carry cannot be extinguished. The cell they threw me into was as small as a coffin, so narrow that I could barely move without my elbows touching the rough, icy walls. The stone floor absorbed the cold of the night and sent it back in sharp waves that ran up my tired legs. No bed, no blanket, no comfort that reminded me I was still human. There, in that stone box, my living death began. And the cruelest thing was not the cramped space, but the emptiness. The emptiness of being ripped from the world and thrown into an oblivion that seemed to have no end. For the first few days, the only sounds I heard were screams. They weren't mine. They were echoes of others. Echoes of pain, of pleading, of despair. Men I couldn't see but whose anguish shot through the walls like invisible arrows. I wondered who they were, what they had done, if any of them even remembered their own name. Each scream was a cruel reminder of where I was and how insignificant human life had become in this place. And yet, I still tried to believe that maybe, just maybe, it would end soon. But time passed, and the screams that filled the hallway became mine. When they came to get me, the hands that dragged me were like merciless claws. When pain shot through my body, it spread not only to my muscles but also to my spirit. Each beating session, each cruel blow, each insult spat against my faith seemed to want to rip something out of me that couldn't be touched. And even so there, between muffled screams and invisible tears, a new truth began to be born. The pain was real, but so was the hope. It's curious how the human mind, even in the face of the abyss, still tries to find some thread to hold on to. In the midst of suffering, my mind returned to the praises whispered in our clandestine meetings. I remembered the hand-stitched Bible, the words that had set my soul on fire. And even when everything in me seemed to crumble, those memories were like embers hidden beneath the cold ash of despair. And it was there in the darkness of a nameless cell that I began to understand that suffering can break the body, but it never breaks the soul of someone who has been sealed by the light. The pain can be overwhelming. It can crush bones, steal strength, silence voices. But there is a force greater than pain, the certainty that life does not end where suffering begins. In my windowless cell, I discovered that faith is stronger than the coldest steel. Do you believe that even in the midst of the greatest pain, God can still be present? Answer here, yes or no, and prepare your heart. Because in the next chapter, what they did to me would defy everything a body can endure. But my soul had already made its choice. They broke my fingers, one by one, without rushing, as if they wanted to extend the pain as long as possible. The dry cracking of bones echoed in the cell, mixed with the muffled sound of my own moans. Feeling the structure of the hand, the one that held the Bible, that pressed the shoulders of the brothers in prayer, being slowly destroyed was one of the first shocks that taught me. There, in that place, pain would be my inseparable companion. And still, no matter how much my body screamed, something inside me refused to bend. Not satisfied, they pulled out my nails. They used iron tongs, pulling each one while singing communist songs at the top of their lungs. It was a cruel attempt to mock my faith. While my fingers bled, they celebrated, as if violence could prove that their ideology was stronger than the truth I carried. The salt, poured onto the open wounds, made my body twitch involuntarily. It was as if every cell was screaming in agony. But, incredible as it may seem, it wasn't this pain that hurt me the most. What really tore me up inside was when they mocked the name of Jesus. When they mocked, spitting words of contempt against the one who was my life, my everything. Every joke, every blasphemy, every insult directed at my Savior was like an invisible spear that pierced not my body, but my soul. I cried, not because of the lashes, not because of the broken bones, but because I knew that these men, so hardened and blind, were mocking the only hope that could save them too. And in this type of pain, there was no human medicine capable of relieving it. The nights were even worse. The cold cut my skin like invisible razors. The cell turned into an ice chamber, where every breath became an effort. I was shaking so much that sometimes it felt like my bones would break just from the vibration. Huddled in a corner, with my body scarred and my spirit still burning, I understood that surviving there did not depend only on physical resistance, but on a much deeper force, faith. And it was there, between moans, spasms, and broken prayers, that I uttered words that became my anchor. Lord, make my pain a song that only your throne can hear. Every word of that prayer was not said easily. It was ripped from the deepest part of me. It was a cry from the soul that no longer expected anything from this world, but that insisted on crying out to heaven. While hell celebrated my torture, I made my pain an offering, an invisible melody that I knew ascended to the throne of God. And as much as they tried to destroy me, they were too late, because the faith that dwells in the spirit of someone who has found the true light can no longer be extinguished, no matter how intense the darkness around is. If you have read historical accounts of political prison camps, you know that many succumbed not only to physical violence, but mainly to psychological breakdown. The goal of totalitarian regimes has never been just to hurt the body, but to crush the soul, to erase identity, to destroy faith. But with me, every blow, every mockery, every freezing night only served to forge something harder than iron, an unbreakable faith molded in the furnaces of suffering. And it was just the beginning, as because what was yet to come would be an even greater proof of what I carried inside me. Physical pain can bend the body, but spiritual pain only reveals what is already rooted in the soul. Hell tried to erase my faith with torture, but instead it helped carve it even deeper into eternity. Do you believe that true faith is stronger than any physical pain? Answer here, yes or no. Don't leave there. In the next chapter, you will see how even in the most extreme moments, something absolutely supernatural began to happen inside the prison. It was there, among screams and shadows, that I saw Mikhail's face. I was no longer the strong, vibrant man I once knew. Now, he was just skin and bones, spectre hanging from a rusty pole, his arms open like a macabre crucifix, supporting the full weight of a body that had already been betrayed by hunger and violence. His eyes, half closed from pain and fatigue, still shone in a way that not even torture could erase. It was the kind of image that the world calls defeat, but which in the eyes of heaven was the purest form of victory. Every bruise on his body was like a letter written silently for anyone who wanted to read. I'm still here. I still believe. His skin felt like paper torn in several places, revealing open bloody wounds. There was a supernatural dignity in the way Mikhail resisted, even when his own body no longer had the strength to fight. He didn't beg, I didn't cry, he didn't curse, he just sang. And that, in that darkness saturated with despair, was a scandal of hope. His voice was trembling, almost extinguished, like a flame about to be blown by the wind. And yet, what he murmured echoed with the strength of 1,000 armies. Glory to the Lamb and who conquered death. Each word seemed to tear through the charged atmosphere of the prison, as if a window were opening in the middle of the darkness. There, before the blind eyes of the guards and the brutality of the regime, Mihail did something that no human force could prevent. He loved. And his worship was so real, so sincere, that it seemed to change the very air around us. It was at that moment that something changed inside me, even with hunger, tearing my insides, even with thirst drying my lips until they bled, even with fatigue paralyzing my muscles. I realized that there was a stronger reality than all that pain. At that moment, I understood that heaven doesn't begin where things go right. Heaven begins exactly where the world only sees the end. And there, as I saw Mihail hanging like a defenseless lamb, singing his surrender to the eternal God, I realized that no cell, no whip, no humiliation could nullify the triumph of the cross in our souls. Few know this, but in prison camps spread across communist Europe, singing a Christian hymn was considered as serious an offense as trying to escape. It was a direct affront to the system. So, hearing Mihail sing, even though he was so weak that he could barely hold his head up, was like hearing a silent revolution rise up in the middle of hell. It was a reminder that true freedom could never be stripped from those who had found life beyond this life. And each murmured verse was, "O challenge thrown at the invisible powers that thought they had defeated us." As I closed my eyes that night, lying on the cold, miserable floor of my cell, I could still hear the soft echo of Mihail's voice carrying through the corridors. It wasn't a tuneful song, it was not beautiful by the world's standards, but to me, and I'm sure to heaven itself, it was the purest, bravest, most glorious sound a human being could make. And I silently decided that if one day my voice was also all I had left, I would use every last breath to sing the same truth. There are moments when faith stops being an idea and becomes living flesh, suffering, bleeding, but never surrendering. What I saw that night forever changed my definition of victory, and honestly, there was nothing the guards could do to defeat a heart that had already been won by the Lamb. Do you believe that worshipping God in the midst of pain is one of the most powerful forms of victory? Leave your answer here, yes or no. Don't leave there. You will know the deepest wound I've experienced. Not the one made by enemies, but the one that came from where I least expected it. One day, I saw a man wearing a regime uniform arrive. In prison, we learned to fear that uniform as much as we feared pain. It was a symbol of corrupted power, of soulless brutality. But that morning, something was even more terrifying. As the man approached, I could see his face better in the dim light that invaded the corridors, and my heart froze. He wasn't a stranger, it was Pavel. The same Pavel who not long ago had preached to our little clandestine group with tears streaming from his eyes. The same Pavel who said he preferred death to denying Christ. Now he wore the uniform of our oppressors. The image was so surreal that for a moment my brain refused to accept what it saw. I remembered nights when Pavel led fervent prayers, nights when we shook more with emotion than fear. I remembered his arms raised, his words full of hope, but now those arms carried another flag. He walked with a firm step, but his gaze avoided mine, as if somewhere inside there was still a spark of shame trying to survive. But any mercy I might have felt disappeared when I saw what he did next. He stopped in front of me, and without hesitation he spat in my direction. The gesture was quick, but its violence burned like fire. It wasn't just physical humiliation. It was the denial of everything we had already built together in faith and communion. Pavel looked at me with hard eyes and uttered the words that echo in my memory to this day. "Eliah, the party is your savior now. Join us." There was no invitation in his voice, just command. It was as if, for him, my faith was now a disease to be forcibly cured, a stain to be erased in the name of a new order. I wanted to respond. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake that man and demand that he remember who he had been. But my voice didn't come out. Instead, it was my heart that screamed, a silent, torn, aching scream. Because the pain of betrayal from someone you love cannot be compared to any physical torture. It is a pain that penetrates beyond the flesh, beyond the bones, reaching the most intimate fibers of the soul. Pavel, the brother of faith who had once walked with me, was now a tool in the hands of the same regime that persecuted us. And there, at that moment, something inside me broke in a different way. History teaches us that totalitarian regimes knew how to use despair to corrupt hearts. Often it wasn't just the torture that broke a man, it was the promise of relief, of survival, of protection for his family. Sometimes it was simply the exhaustion of a soul crushed over the years. I don't judge what led Pavel to choose what he did, but in that moment, to me, he wasn't just a traitor. He was a cruel reminder that even the strongest can fall, and understanding that was more painful than any lash I could have received. But still, I prayed for him. In that cold cell, with the bitter taste of betrayal in my mouth, I bowed my heart before God and whispered, "Lord, have mercy on Pavel, because if it weren't for your grace, it could have been me there." And as I prayed this prayer, an unexpected peace began to fill the void left by the pain. I understood that the real victory wasn't keeping hate out of prison. It was stopping it from entering my heart. And at that moment, without even knowing it, I was taking another step on the journey of transformation that hell would never be able to stop. Betrayals have the power to break us from the inside out, but forgiving, even when everything in us calls for justice, is the greatest act of spiritual freedom we can experience. It wasn't Pavel that was the real enemy. It was the silent corruption that tries to steal the most sacred thing we have, our faith, our mercy, our hope. Do you believe it is possible to forgive someone who betrayed us so deeply? Leave your answer here, yes or no, and don't let go, because something even more surprising was about to happen, and it would show that even in the midst of darkness, the sky never stops acting. After 14 years, they opened the cell. For a moment, I thought it was another trick, a new form of psychological torture. Nobody said anything. No orders, no insults, no blows, just the rusty sound of the key turning and the door being pulled. The light invaded the darkness like a blade, cutting through the gloom that had been my only companion for so long. My eyes, accustomed to absolute pitch black, couldn't bear the light. I tried to get up, but my knees, weakened by time, hunger and pain, gave way before I could even take the first step. Rough arms lifted me as if I were made of paper. There was no dignity in that gesture, only haste and contempt. I walked, or rather I was dragged, through corridors that seemed to have no end. I didn't know where they were taking me. I didn't know if it was freedom or the end. In places like this, hope and despair walk side by side, and every corner can be a final sentence. But at that moment, I didn't have the strength to question it. I could only put one foot in front of the other, guided more by my remaining faith than by the strength of my broken body. We arrived at a heavy door. It opened with a creak that seemed to herald doom itself. Stepping outside the cell for the first time in years, the light outside hit me with a violence that words cannot describe. It was as if each beam of light was a spear piercing my pale, sensitive skin. I tried to lift my face, but my eyes were watering with pain, forcing me to keep them half closed. It was in this state of confusion and fragility that, among figures and shapes distorted by the light, I saw her. Sabina, slimmer, older, marked by time and pain, but still, she was her. Those eyes that had looked at me lovingly from before the bars, eyes that had cried with me in silent prayers, were still there. And in some inexplicable way they continued to shine. Speechless, no questions, no speeches. She just hugged me, a tight, sincere hug, desperately full of life. A hug that ignored the distance, the pain, the years, the visible and invisible scars. And it was in that hug that all hell fell silent. Sabina didn't need to say anything. That gesture said everything that human words could never express. There, in that simple intertwining of arms, God showed me that love is stronger than suffering, more resistant than shackles, more powerful than death. While the regime tried to erase our history, while the world turned its back, while darkness surrounded every breath of hope, love remained. And it was He, and only He, who brought me back to life. Because there are things that pain can try to kill, but true love, that not even death can overcome. Interestingly, modern studies on survivors of concentration camps and political prisons show that what most strengthened those who survived was not physical strength, but emotional hope, the expectation of meeting someone again, of hugging someone, of being remembered. And I experienced it in the flesh. It was the memory of Sabina's eyes that sustained me in the days when all that existed was pain. And now, seeing her there touching my marked skin was living proof that my fight had not been in vain. And even without strength, even with a tired soul, inside me, a flame burned again. Sometimes a hug can be more powerful than any formal release. The embrace of someone who never gave up on us even when everyone else did is the purest language of heaven on earth. That day, between silent tears and surviving hearts, I learned that God never forgets those who truly love Him. Do you believe that true love has the power to overcome even the worst pains in life? Answer here, yes or no. Stay with me, because the story is not over yet. And what comes next will show that being physically freed is just the beginning of a much bigger battle. Today I speak in front of crowds. The world looks at me as if it were a survivor, a living witness to brutality and hope. But I know I'm not here on my own merit. Every word I speak, every testimony I share, every tear I shed in front of my audience is not mine. They are echoes of those who died in silence, with faith burning in their hearts until their last breath. I am just the mouth of many whose voices the world has tried to silence forever, and I fail miserably in trying to express the greatness of their courage. I speak for those who are still in dark cells today, whose knees bleed on cold floors, while their lips still dare to pronounce the most powerful name that has ever echoed across the earth, Jesus. I speak for those who, even amidst screams, beatings, and threats, choose to love, forgive, and resist. My testimony is not a trophy of personal overcoming. It is a torch inherited from souls who preferred to die rather than deny the light they carried. And every time I step into a pulpit, it's as if I take their faces with me. Every scar, every prayer, every praise whispered in the dark. I am the voice of Mihail, the one who, even hanging and broken, sang glory to the Lamb in the midst of pain. I am the echo of Pavel's last praise. Even he who failed taught me that grace can redeem even the most torn stories. I am the sigh of every soul who chose eternity over convenience, the cross over the easy crown. And it is this mission that sustains me, not for their own glory, but so that their sacrifice will never be forgotten. If you've made it this far, listening to every bit of this story, I ask you just one thing. Do not deny with silence what so many have affirmed with blood. The world we live in still tries to silence the truth. He still tries to mock faith. He still tries to bury hope under layers of fear and conformism. But you, me, we are called to be the generation that will not remain silent. We are called to be the echo of those who paid the ultimate price for the love of the living Christ. Christ lives, Christ reigns, Christ comes. And that's not just a nice phrase. It is the anchor that sustained entire generations through torture, exile, and execution. It is the promise that set hearts on fire in nameless prisons. It is the truth that calls us today, not just to believe, but to live with courage, to love with renunciation, to proclaim without fear. And if they could sing in dark, doubt we can shout it from the rooftops. Suffering is not the end of the story, it never was. The cross was not the end of Christ, it was the beginning of the resurrection. And in the same way, every tear, every wound, every loss we bear because of faith is actually a seed of eternity being planted. Perhaps you have never faced physical arrests. Perhaps your prison has another name: fear, doubt, shame. But the message remains the same. There is freedom for those who cling to the hope that hell cannot erase. If this story touched your heart, if something inside you burned while hearing those words, subscribe to the channel now, not just to hear more stories, but to become part of a generation that won't shut up. And get ready. In the next video, we'll dive even deeper into testimonies that prove that the light shines brightest just when the darkness seems to win. See you there.